Twilight falls on Roman Britain. As legions abandon the island, chaos erupts in their wake. Witness the desperate gamble of Vortigern, inviting Saxon warriors who become conquerors. Feel the anguish of British refugees fleeing burning villages, their world collapsing into darkness. Then marvel as heroes emerge, Ambrosius and Arthur, rallying shattered tribes against overwhelming odds. Their victories bring decades of peace before betrayal and division doom their cause. Through plague, treachery, and battlefield glory, experience the epic struggle that transformed a Roman province into Saxon kingdoms. The forgotten war that birthed England awaits, where legend and history blur into one extraordinary tale. Frost clung to the stone ramparts of Britain's northern frontier as soldiers marched away under the banners of Magnus Maximus. Their boots struck the frozen earth in grim rhythm, leaving behind garrisons that would never again see reinforcements from Rome. 4 centuries of imperial power drained from the island with each departing cohort, the eagles vanishing across the sea toward continental ambitions. To those who remained, it was as if the sun itself had begun to set on a world they thought eternal. Maximus's gamble for the purple throne stripped Britain of its defenders. Villas still gleamed with mosaics, marketplaces hummed with trade, and towns clung to the appearance of Roman order. But the arteries of protection had been cut. Where legionaries once patrolled, silence crept in. Watchtowers along Hadrian's wall stood like teeth in an abandoned jaw, proud yet powerless against the painted warriors who gathered beyond the hills. Life continued, though uneasily. In estates like Chedworth and Lullingstone, landowners still hosted feasts beneath painted frescoes, but beyond their walls, the countryside began to change. Roads once paved for chariots and imperial couriers cracked beneath neglect. Weeds clawed through cobblestones while carts rattled across uneven tracks. Coinage, the heartbeat of commerce, slowed to a feeble pulse. After the year 402, no new imperial currency reached the island. Farmers returned to barter, trading grain for cloth, cattle for tools. As the glitter of Roman silver slipped into memory, storms gathered from every horizon. To the north, the Picts sharpened spears and painted themselves for war, remembering centuries of defeat, yet sensing opportunity in the hollowed empire. They crossed the borderlands with swift raids, torching villas and carrying captives into their misted highlands. From the west, Irish raiders launched curraghs across the sea, sails billowing with hunger for slaves and plunder. And from the east, over the grey waters of the North Sea, came the first restless stirrings of the Saxons. In the windswept lands of Schleswig-Holstein and Engeln, pressure mounted like a tide against fragile shores. Franks pressed from the south, Danes loomed from the north, and soil too thin for growing families forced younger sons to look outward. Timber halls echoed with stories of a rich island undefended, its villas laden with grain and treasure. Traces show their departure in earnest. Weapons buried with the dead in Holstein, genetic threads woven from Angeln to Britain, longships slipping from shallow harbours toward horizons promised by rumour. Meanwhile, within Britain itself, civic pride flickered like a candle guttering in wind. The councils that once debated law and collected taxes dwindled. Curial offices went unfilled as wealthy families abandoned towns for fortified estates. At Silchester and St. Albans, walls still stood, but behind them, marketplaces shrank, temples closed, and bathhouses cooled into ruin. Only scattered Christian communities kept some sense of order, preserving Latin prayers even as spoken tongues fractured into old dialects. The final signal of abandonment came in 410. Honorius, embattled in Italy by Visigothic threats, dispatched a terse reply to the islanders who begged for aid. "Defend yourselves," he instructed. No legion would return. No eagle would soar again across the channel. The rescript of Honorius echoed like a death knell across the island. Britain was Roman no longer. It was on its own. Yet the people did not vanish. Farmers ploughed furrows as they had for generations, though tools grew rusted without smiths trained in continental fashions. Pottery industries that had once supplied towns collapsed. Shards scattered in workshops never fired again. Local kilns smouldered briefly, producing crude vessels far removed from the polished wares of earlier centuries. The landscape itself testified to retreat. Mosaics buried under earth, hippocausts silenced, villas deserted one by one. Archaeologists uncover their stories in collapsed roofs and discarded tools. Frozen in the moment, families fled. Some estates endured, turning inward for survival. At Chedworth, a handful of families maintained rooms long after imperial officials departed, patching walls with whatever material lay to hand. The grandeur faded, but the instinct to hold on endured. In such places, Romano-British culture lingered in twilight. Latin inscriptions carved on memorial stones, Christian symbols scratched onto wood and stone, the last whispers of a civilization trying not to drown. Power shifted to local warlords. Without the legions, authority fell to men who could command loyalty with sword and gift. Hill forts once abandoned under Rome's peace found new life as refuges. Cadbury Castle, rising over Somerset Hills, bristled again with timber palisades and hastily dug ditches. Within such strongholds, leaders proclaimed themselves protectors, kings even, though their dominions stretched only as far as their retainers' spears allowed. Some clung to Roman titles, others revived ancestral claims, all alike fighting for survival. Beyond these desperate measures, the island's fate drew closer with every tide. Longboats slid onto pebble shores, carrying men hardened by hunger and hope. They brought spather swords long favoured in continental service, round shields painted with beasts, and axes that could hew both timber and flesh. At first, their raids were little more than lightning strikes, smoke rising from coastal farms, captives chained, goods stolen. But behind these skirmishes lay migrations, families waiting across the sea to join warriors who carved footholds into Britain's coast. Still, Britain was not wholly undone. In Tintagel and along the western reaches, Mediterranean goods continued to arrive. Shards of amphorae carrying wine and oil, proof that trade survived even in this darkening age. Merchants braved hostile seas to exchange goods, weaving the island into fragile networks that stretched toward Gaul and Iberia. Christianity, too, whispered across communities, offering hope against the chaos. Yet each connection grew thinner, each bond weaker, as the island slipped further from the orbit of empire. The collapse was not a single moment, but a gathering storm that wore away foundations year by year. It began with legions marching away under Maximus, deepened when councils failed and coins ceased, and hardened into crisis when Honorius turned his back. By 410, Britain stood at a threshold between worlds. No longer Roman, not yet Saxon, but a land of villas crumbling, warlords rising, and shadows lengthening from every horizon. On the broken roads, travelers moved between ruins, speaking in tongues that blended Latin with older Celtic words. Children grew up never seeing a legionary, never hearing the horns that once signaled order across provinces. Their lullabies came not from Virgil's verses, but from ancestral songs revived by firesides. In their lives, the old world had already vanished, and something new, harsh uncertain but inevitable, was waiting to be born. Ashes smouldered where once villas had shone with painted ceilings and warm mosaics. The island, abandoned by imperial decree, struggled to breathe without the lungs of Rome. After the rescript of Honorius I told the Britons to defend themselves, fear became the common tongue. The legions were gone, their order, their steel, and their wages gone with them. What remained were ordinary families, bending over fields, clinging to farms, and praying that the next raid would pass them by. With the empire's mantle torn away, power splintered into fragments. Communities looked to men who could promise protection, some born of the old villa class, others hardened by war and ambition. A handful clung to Latin titles in hopes of preserving a ghost of the empire. Others reached for older words, calling themselves kings in the tongue of their ancestors. Yet their domains were fragile things, shifting with the season's battles, won and lost in days rather than decades. Britain, once a single province, had become a mosaic of quarreling lords. The cracks widened with every raid. Painted warriors from the north streamed past neglected fortifications, their torches leaving farmsteads charred and hollow. The Picts had learned patience under Roman steel. Now they unleashed it with abandon. To the west, the Scotti, Irish seafarers whose leather boats skimmed the waves, snatched captives and cattle with merciless hunger. And from the east came sails that grew larger with each summer. Saxon prows biting into Britain's shores, carrying men who came to plunder but also to stay. Fear drove the people to fortify what had been left behind. Ancient hill forts, silent for centuries, bristled again with palisades. Families dragged stones into gaps in broken Roman walls, kindling fires atop towers that had long stood cold. In places like Cadbury, the earthworks of ancestors found new purpose as refuges. These makeshift strongholds were a poor shadow of legionary camps, yet they gave courage to those who could huddle behind them, clinging to survival through vigilance and sweat. Commerce shrank to the scale of the village. The flow of coins had ended with Rome, leaving barter as the rhythm of daily life. Grain traded for wool, cattle for salt, tools for food. Workshops, once tied to continental markets, turned to local needs. Rough pots, patched blades, and coarse cloth. Traces of once great industries flickered on, but no more amphorae arrived from the south. No fresh silver jingled in the marketplace. Life narrowed to what could be made by hand and grown from the soil. Amid this hardship rose figures who sought to bind fractured communities under their banners. Most names vanished with the smoke of their hearths, but one endured, Vortigern, whose title meant High King. His power rested not on ancient laws, but on the loyalty of warriors who dined in his hall, bound to him by gifts of land and feasts of mead. For a time, he seemed the island's best hope, a man capable of uniting rivals against the storm that battered every border. But even Vortigern faced a choice too perilous to bear alone. The painted warriors pressed from the north. Irish raiders carved footholds into the west. Desperation turned him to a bold gamble. Invite the Saxons themselves, those feared seafarers, to fight in his service. Where his retainers faltered, their steel might prevail. In return, he would grant them land on which to settle. To some, it seemed salvation. To others, it smelled of betrayal, as if the wolves were being welcomed into the fold. The ships that carried these newcomers were shallow vessels, built to slip into river mouths and beach upon open shores. From them spilled not only warriors with long swords and round shields, but also women, children, and elders. They carried seeds, tools, and the will to root themselves in new soil. Their very presence marked a shift from raiding to settlement. Traces of their language clung to new villages, their sounds taking root in the east, even as Latin still lingered in the west. So the island divided. Along the western valleys, priests still carved Latin prayers into stone, keeping alive the rhythms of Rome. But in the east, Germanic tongues grew louder with every passing season. Place names whispered of change, law and custom bent beneath foreign ways, and alliances began to knit across cultural lines. The land no longer spoke with one voice. It was becoming a chorus of discordant tongues and clashing traditions. Thus, the years after 410 forged a crucible in which the old world melted away. Warlords rose and fell. Fortresses bristled against enemies without and rivals within. Raids, hunger, and shifting loyalties shaped every waking moment. Yet through this chaos, something new was being born. The framework of kingdoms that would one day carry names remembered for centuries. And when Vortigern opened his doors to the sea wolves, he lit the torch that would guide Britain into its next chapter, the coming of the Saxons. Wind swept over the Thames estuary as sails appeared on the horizon, their dragon-headed prows rising and falling with the tide. For the Britons who watched from the shore, fear and hope mingled uneasily. These were the men summoned by Vortigern, the High King, who believed foreign steel might succeed where local spears had faltered. The Picts raided ceaselessly from the north. The Scotti harried western coasts, and British defences crumbled. To call in outsiders was desperate, but in desperation, the gamble seemed worth the risk. From across the North Sea they came, Saxons from Holstein, Angles from the peninsula of Angeln, and Jutes from the storm-swept land of Jutland. Each tribe carried its own traditions, its own gods, its own hunger for land. They had long known Britain as a place for plunder. Now they came not just as raiders, but as mercenaries and settlers, answering Vortigern's invitation with both ambition and calculation. 3 ships landed first, a small band led by brothers whose names would echo across centuries: Hengist, the stallion, and Horsa, the horse. Their warriors were unlike the remnants of Roman-trained levies who fought for Britain. Tall men with flowing hair and fierce eyes, they bore long swords called spatae, heavy axes fit to split both helm and shield, and round bucklers painted with beasts. Each man swore loyalty to his leader in bonds deeper than coin, oaths spoken before gods like Woden and Thuna, binding warrior to lord until death. They fought not as drilled ranks, but as war bands, each man seeking to win glory for his chief and for himself. Vortigern welcomed them with gifts and promises. Thanet, an island guarding the Thames mouth, was offered as their first settlement. From its shores, they could guard Britain's eastern approaches and strike swiftly against Pictish raiders who slipped southward. It was an old Roman solution. Let barbarians fight barbarians, retooled for a land no longer able to defend itself. At first, the arrangement seemed to work. Saxon blades cut down northern raiders with an efficiency that astonished both allies and enemies. Vortigern's prestige swelled as he presented victory after victory, though the credit belonged as much to his hired allies as to his own spears. The brothers Hengist and Horsa proved canny leaders. Where others saw mercenary service, they saw opportunity. The island's wealth impressed them. The fertile fields, the cattle herds, the towns clinging stubbornly to Roman walls. They knew their homeland could not provide such abundance. Soil was thin in Angeln, forests crowded Holstein, and Frankish expansion pressed hard against Saxon borders. To carve a place in Britain was to secure a future for their people. Soon, messages crossed the sea. calling kinsmen to join them. What began with 3 ships would soon become a flood. As the first warbands settled, the shape of their life took root. Timber halls rose, modelled after those in their old homelands, smoke curling from hearths where warriors gathered to drink and boast. Women and children followed, though fewer at first, creating households that mingled Germanic custom with the landscape of Britain. Farms spread outward from their halls, worked by hands eager to claim permanent inheritance rather than fleeting plunder. The pattern repeated along the coast, each settlement a small seed of what would grow into kingdoms. Not all Britons resisted. Some landowners saw advantage in making peace with these formidable neighbours. Alliances were struck through marriage, tying Saxon chiefs to villa families in bonds that carried both risk and promise. Children of such unions learned 2 tongues and 2 traditions, standing as bridges between cultures that had once seemed utterly opposed. Others, however, saw only treachery. The wolves had been welcomed into the fold, and the fold itself grew smaller with every passing season. Still, for a time, cooperation continued. Saxon mercenaries defended Britain's shores while extending their own footholds. Their victories against northern raiders gave them a reputation of invincibility, yet their appetite grew. Land was demanded not just for halls, but for entire communities, arriving from across the sea. Warriors no longer asked for wages, they asked for estates. Vortigern, once master of the arrangement, found himself bargaining from weakness, his authority waning with each Saxon request he dared not refuse. The flow of newcomers quickened. Along the eastern coast, long ships beached in growing numbers, spilling out entire families. Angles settled the flatlands of the east that would one day bear their name. Saxons carved holdings in the south, laying the foundations for realms remembered as Sussex and Essex. Jutes claimed territory in Kent, their foothold close to the Thames giving them both power and prominence. What had begun as mercenary service was now becoming colonization. The island was changing, and nothing could turn the tide. Among their people, stories carried back across the sea told of Britain's weakness and wealth. Men who had once been poor fishermen or landless warriors now boasted of farms fat with cattle, halls filled with plunder, and wives taken from conquered lands. Each tale drew more across the waves. Continental pressures, Franks closing off expansion, rival tribes vying for land, pushed them outward, and Britain pulled them like a lodestone. Soon, the flow of settlers outstripped any power the Britons had to control. Signs of their permanence spread quickly. Burials marked the land, not in Roman urns, but in graves filled with weapons and jewelry, symbols of rank and belief. Pagan shrines rose where temples had once honored Jupiter and Christ alike, groves where sacrifices honored foreign gods. The landscape of Britain began to wear new colors, each settlement an assertion that this was not borrowed ground, but homeland. Still, tension brewed beneath the surface. Vortigern and his allies, who had once thought themselves masters of the bargain, now faced the reality of dependence. The very warriors they had invited began to press for more land than they had been granted. Each request was backed by the threat of arms. The balance of power shifted, subtle at first, then undeniable. It was only a matter of time before peace gave way to open conflict. For the moment, however, the uneasy partnership endured. The Britons held their western and central strongholds, rallying under leaders who still dreamed of restoring unity. The Saxons expanded along the eastern coasts, planting their halls and villages. Between them stretched a fragile frontier, a line drawn not on maps, but in rivers, forests, and blood. Across this line, the future of the island would be contested in fire and iron. Thus, the years between 430 and 450 became a hinge of history. From the west, the last heirs of Roman Britain struggled to hold fragments of their inheritance. From the east, Saxon, Angle, and Jute warbands transformed from hired swords into settlers and lords, and at the center stood Vortigern, remembered both as savior and betrayer, whose desperate bargain would echo through centuries. The day would soon come when this fragile cooperation collapsed in treachery and war, when the feast of peace turned into the slaughter of the Long Knives. The alliance between Britons and Saxons was never meant to last. What began as a contract of service soon hardened into rivalry, and rivalry turned swiftly into betrayal. Vortigern had welcomed Hengist and Horsa as protectors, granting land in Kent and gifts of cattle to secure their loyalty. Yet the more success these mercenaries found, the more obvious it became that they were no longer servants. They were becoming masters of their own destiny, and Britain itself would pay the price. Hengist understood the balance of power better than his host. His followers grew stronger with every new ship that landed, their halls rising along river valleys once guarded by Roman spears. Warriors who had come as hired blades now sent for wives and children, shaping permanent settlements out of temporary camps. To restrain them would have required unity among the Britons, but unity had already fractured into squabbling lordships. Vortigern still claimed the title of High King, yet beyond his hall, his commands carried little weight. It was during a peace conference that trust finally collapsed. Chroniclers told of the treachery of the Long Knives, a banquet where British nobles gathered to negotiate with their Saxon allies. What followed was no feast, but a slaughter. Saxon warriors, blades hidden beneath their cloaks, rose at a signal and cut down their hosts. Whether the story preserves exact truth or legend shaped by memory hardly matters. The tale captured the reality of the age. Trust had ended, and the island would now be carved by blood. Battles followed one upon another. Hengist's followers turned openly against the very lords who had hired them, seizing territory that had once been offered as reward. At Aylesford, Horsa fell in combat, cut down while leading his warband. His death, far from breaking Saxon resolve, steeled it. Hengist, hardened by decades of raiding and conquest, pressed forward with renewed determination. For him, the land itself was now the prize, and he would not turn back while his people's future depended on victory. The Britons reeled under these blows. Their armies were no longer drilled legions, but hastily gathered warbands, fighting under local chiefs with limited coordination. Courage they possessed in abundance, but discipline and unity were scarce. Saxon fighters, bound to their lords by oaths that death alone could break, met them with ferocity sharpened by hunger for new estates. Where once Roman formations had dominated the battlefield, now small groups of armored warriors clashed in chaotic melees, each man seeking to prove his worth before lord and gods alike. Weapons themselves told the story of change. The Roman gladius, symbol of disciplined ranks, gave way to the long sword, broad-bladed, double-edged, fit for single combat rather than formation fighting. Alongside it came the axe, heavy-headed and brutal, capable of shattering shields and skulls alike. Round shields of wood and iron-bound bosses formed shifting walls of defense, while spears remained the common weapon of both sides. The battlefield was no longer the arena of empires, but of tribes, where warbands measured honor in personal valor as much as in victory. Burials reflected the divide as clearly as battle. British dead were laid to rest under Christian rites, graves marked with crosses and prayers for eternal salvation. Saxon fallen were interred with their weapons, grave goods beside them to accompany the journey to their gods. Even in death, the two peoples stood apart, neighbors on the same island, yet divided by faith, custom, and vision of the world beyond. Terrain shaped the struggle as much as arms. Britons who knew the hills and valleys used them for ambush, harassing invaders in forests and marshes where heavy shields became a burden. Saxons, however, excelled in open ground, where their tight-knit warbands could fight as one. River crossings, ridges, and old Roman roads became prizes in themselves, fought over as fiercely as treasure hoards, for they offered control over movement in a land now split by war. Horses began to change the character of conflict. Among British elites, mounted warriors emerged, using speed to strike and withdraw, challenging Saxon infantry in ways unfamiliar to them. Cavalry was no longer the auxiliary arm of Roman command, but the chosen weapon of local lords seeking advantage. Though small in number, these mounted fighters represented a shift toward the age of knights yet to come, a glimpse of a future growing out of the ruins of Rome. Still, even innovation could not erase the reality that Saxon numbers grew with each passing year. More ships arrived, more warriors landed, and more halls rose across the landscape. Hengist's command was no longer that of a mercenary captain. He stood as a lord in his own right, ruling land seized by the sword. His followers carved estates out of conquered villages, ploughing soil with the same hands that once wielded weapons. They were no longer strangers, they were settlers, permanent and determined. The Britons fought back with fury, rallying behind leaders who emerged from the chaos. Some sources spoke of Ambrosius Aurelianus rising in these years, though his greatest deeds lay ahead. What mattered now was that resistance did not vanish. Hill forts filled with refugees, bands of warriors struck at Saxon lines of supply, and Christian priests offered hope in the face of despair. Though defeats outnumbered victories, the will to fight endured. Even so, the losses cut deep. Towns that had survived Rome's departure now fell to flame. London, already fading, slipped further into decline. Villas once filled with mosaics became ruins overgrown with brambles. The memory of empire dimmed as each generation grew farther removed from the age of legions. For many, Rome was no longer a living power, but a fading story, and the struggle for survival became the only reality. By the mid-450s, Britain stood transformed. The Saxons held firm ground in Kent and along the coasts, their warbands entrenched and their halls standing proud. Britons clung to their western valleys and highlands, battered but unbroken. Between the two, the frontier hardened, a shifting, violent border where lives were lost daily. The dream of restoring Rome's order was gone. In its place stood a brutal contest between old inhabitants and new arrivals, each determined to claim the island as their own. The treachery at the banquet had shattered the illusion of partnership. The death of Horsa, the rise of Hengist, and the defeats suffered by British lords marked a turning point. No longer was it a question of service or alliance. It was a struggle for possession, for the right to call this land home. The next decades would see chaos deepen, famine spread, and entire towns vanish. But amid the wreckage, new leaders would rise. Men who carried the last embers of Roman order and dared to strike back against the tide. War left scars, not only on men, but on the land itself. Charred timbers marked where once vibrant towns had stood, their streets silent, their walls gaping like broken teeth. Across the countryside, families abandoned farmsteads and crowded into high places, fortresses reborn from older ages. Hilltops once left quiet under Rome, now rang again with the sound of axes cutting palisades and the cries of children huddled behind timber walls. The island had become a patchwork of refugees and ashes, each one telling the same story. The struggle to survive after trust had failed. Saxon warbands pressed their advantage with unrelenting ferocity. Victories at Aylesford and Crayford gave them not only land, but confidence, and every ship that landed swelled their ranks further. They marched inland, burning villages and seizing cattle, their long-haired warriors boasting of spoils around fire-lit halls. What they could not hold, they ravaged, leaving blackened fields to starve the survivors. To those who fled westward, the smoke rising over the lowlands was a constant reminder that the eastern heart of Britain was slipping away. Britons fought back as best they could, but unity remained elusive. Lords who had once bowed to Vortigern now ruled their own fragments of land, often as rivals rather than allies. Some offered desperate bargains to Saxon chiefs, buying temporary safety with tribute or the surrender of hostages. Others fought with grim resolve, knowing that each stand might mean annihilation for their households. Small victories flickered like sparks in the dark. Ambushes in forests, surprise raids on isolated settlements, but none burned long enough to reverse the tide. Ordinary people bore the worst of it. Families abandoned homes that had stood for generations, carrying what they could on carts or on their backs, driving herds before them toward the western hills. Hunger followed in their wake. Fields left untended yielded little, and many died on the roads or in hastily built refuges. Tales of famine spread from village to village, years when mothers wept over empty pots, when fathers returned from hunting with nothing but exhaustion, when whole communities disappeared into silence. For those who survived, memories of Rome's abundance seemed like a dream, slipping further from reach. The ruins of once great towns deepened the sense of loss. London, already declining after the Empire's withdrawal, emptied almost entirely. Silchester, proud in earlier centuries, fell into desolation. St. Albans and other market centres followed, their baths cold, their temples deserted, their walls standing as hollow shells. Merchants no longer gathered there, nor councils, nor soldiers. What remained were weeds in the streets and scavengers searching among toppled stones. The hum of urban life faded until only silence answered footsteps in places once filled with thousands. Even as cities died, new settlements emerged. Along the sandy heathlands, Saxons raised halls of timber where once stood villa estates. Weststow, and others like it, showed how newcomers turned soil into livelihood. Their farms clustered around central halls, their days marked by herding, weaving, and seasonal rituals. Smoke from their hearths rose steadily, while nearby Roman sites crumbled. To the dispossessed Britons, these places stood as bitter proof that strangers were not merely passing through. They were remaking the land. Not all collapse was met with despair. In the west and north, Christian leaders built small monasteries, planting seeds of resistance not through arms, but through memory. These communities became sanctuaries where learning, prayer, and custom survived the storms outside their cloisters. Monks copied fragments of texts, bishops preached unity, and churches offered what shelter they could. Their voices urged that the island's people were more than scattered tribes. They were heirs of a faith and a tradition worth defending. The coasts remained perilous. Saxon longships still prowled the estuaries, ready to strike at unguarded villages. But Britons, too, learned to fight on the water. Shallow craft guarded harbours, and watchmen scanned the horizon for sails. Skirmishes flared along river mouths, where defenders tried to block landings with chains or stakes. Some ships burned before reaching the shore, but many more landed their warriors. The sea, once a boundary protecting the island, had become a battlefield in its own right. Beneath the chaos lay shifts that could not be measured only in battle or famine. Entire populations were on the move. Burial grounds show traces of these journeys, with communities uprooted from the east and resettling in the west, their graves mingling with those of older generations. Families who once tilled the fields of Kent now found themselves strangers in Cornwall or Wales. Their descendants would remember not only the land lost, but the long wanderings that brought them to new homes. Through it all, stories endured. Around hearths in the western hills, fathers told their sons of legions that once guarded the land, of emperors who commanded order from across the sea, of lords who betrayed or defended their people. Out of grief grew legends, shaping memories into tales of heroes and traitors. The present was chaos, but the past was given new life in story, a past that promised hope of leaders who might rise again. By the end of these years, Britain stood at a breaking point. Saxons held firm in the east and south, their settlements rooted and their warbands unchallenged. Britons remained strong in the west, but divided and battered, their towns abandoned, their people scattered. Famine and plague whispered through valleys already scarred by war. The land was torn between old and new, faith and paganism, ruin and renewal. Still, from such ruin, figures would soon step forward who offered not despair, but resistance. Among them was a man of Roman lineage, Ambrosius Aurelianus, whose name would gather weight in the years ahead. Where others saw only chaos, he would see a chance to rally the broken fragments of a people. The embers of hope had not gone out. They smouldered, waiting for a leader to breathe them into flame. Out of ruin, a name began to spread from valley to valley: Ambrosius. Survivors whispered it in halls where councils still met, and priests invoked it in churches where Latin prayers had never ceased. For a generation, the island had endured chaos, famine, and defeat. Now, in this man of Roman descent, hope found a face. He was remembered by Gildas, centuries later, as a noble born of the last true families of Rome's order. To his contemporaries, he was the leader who dared to rally the shattered pieces of a nation. Ambrosius was no emperor, no commander of legions in shining mail. What he possessed was rarer, a reputation untainted by betrayal, and kinship to the traditions that still held meaning in the Western Hills. His family had clung to the old ways long after the empire's fall. From them, he inherited more than blood. He carried the authority of memory. Where others claimed power through brute strength, he embodied a continuity with Rome itself, however faint that connection had become. Councils gathered again under his banner. Local lords who had once jealously guarded their independence now brought retainers to his cause. In timber halls, messengers proclaimed his summons, and for the first time in years, warbands marched not for personal survival, but for a common struggle. The call was not Rome's, but it echoed the old authority. Defend the island, protect the faith, resist the invader. Britons, weary of flight, found in him a reason to stand. On the high ramparts of Cadbury Castle, voices rang with renewed purpose. The hill, already refortified during the chaos, now became more than a refuge. It was a symbol. New timber walls crowned the earthworks, and within them stood a hall where feasts reminded warriors. They were part of something greater than their scattered homesteads. Here, the warlord's table displayed both native craft and remnants of Roman luxury, a blend that reflected the age itself, half fallen half enduring. Feasts mattered as much as battles. At Ambrosius' table, oaths were sworn, alliances sealed, and rivalries set aside. His household was no mere family dwelling, but a gathering place for leaders who still dreamed of a united land. Cups of mead passed from hand to hand, songs praised the deeds of ancestors, and in the glow of firelight, men found the will to trust one another again. Out of those feasts came armies, each warrior bound not only to one man, but to a vision larger than himself. Trade, too, revived in small measure under his protection. At Tintagel, ships from far coasts still brought wine in amphorae, glass beads, and fine pottery. These traces of connection proved that Britain was not entirely severed from the wider world. Ambrosius fostered such links not by commanding them, but by ensuring his territories were secure enough for merchants to dare the voyage. Every jar of oil and every jug of wine became a reminder that his people were not forgotten. Faith gave his leadership deeper power. Christian priests, long harried by war, now found in him a patron who respected their role. Crosses rose on hilltops where once shrines to old gods had stood. Inscriptions carved into stone bore both native names and the language of Rome, declaring that the faith endured alongside the people. Ambrosius did not conquer in Christ's name alone, but he wove Christian hope into his cause, binding hearts as firmly as swords bound hands. Battles followed, each one hard fought. Saxon warbands, entrenched in the east, were no longer mere raiders. They held villages, estates, and halls. To challenge them required not only courage, but coordination. Ambrosius gave that coordination. Warbands that had once fought separately now struck together, attacking settlements and driving invaders back toward the coast. Victories were few at first, but each success carried a weight beyond its immediate gain. For the first time in years, Britons spoke not of fleeing, but of reclaiming. The sight of Saxons retreating stirred memories of a prouder past. Elders recalled the days of legions, of emperors whose commands reached across the sea. Younger men who had never seen Rome's soldiers now carried that memory second-hand through stories, but it mattered all the same. Ambrosius stood as proof that their heritage was not gone, that the island was not destined to be surrendered without a fight. Hope, fragile but growing, spread with every tale of his victories. Names carved on memorial stones testify to the era's spirit. Families proudly mark their dead as Christians, as heirs of Rome, as warriors of Ambrosius's cause. These inscriptions preserved continuity, reminding all who could read that they were not a broken people, but a people enduring. Where Saxon graves held swords and jewelry, British memorials bore crosses and names, anchoring their identity in both faith and memory of Rome. In the western halls, Ambrosius' reputation grew beyond his actual reach. Even in places he did not directly command, lords invoked his name to rally their followers. His leadership was more than political, it was symbolic. He gave form to an idea, the idea that Britain was not finished, that resistance was still possible, that unity could still be found among ruins. In an age when famine and despair seemed stronger than any army, that idea itself became a weapon. Religion and politics intertwined. Pagan Saxons raised their halls in defiance, honoring gods beneath sacred groves and hearths. Britons answered with crosses lifted high, prayers for deliverance, and hymns sung in stone churches that still stood despite war. Each battle became more than a clash for land. It was a contest of cultures, faiths, and destinies. Ambrosius did not create this divide, but his leadership sharpened it, turning resistance into a cause that touched both body and soul. Stories later attached to him, some perhaps true, others shaped by legend. He was remembered as a commander of great victories, as a protector of the faith, even as a man touched by destiny. Whether all the tales are accurate or not, they reveal the impact he had. People needed heroes, and Ambrosius gave them one, in flesh or in memory. His figure stood tall in the minds of those who followed him, so much so that even centuries later, writers looked back and found in him the model of a leader who turned chaos into defiance. By the decade's end, Britain was still torn between East and West. Saxons did not vanish. Their halls remained, their farms thrived, and their warriors still fought. Yet for the first time since the treachery at the banquet, the balance had shifted. Britons no longer fought only for survival. They fought with the possibility of victory. Ambrosius had not restored Rome, but he had restored courage. In that, his legacy already surpassed the crumbling stones of towns long abandoned. The land stood on edge, waiting for what might follow. Alliances forged under Ambrosius became the foundation for larger struggles, battles that would decide not a single coast or valley, but the fate of Britain itself. His banner called men to the present, but his legacy cleared a path for another, one whose name would outshine his. In the distance, whispers already spoke of Arthur. When Ambrosius called, men answered. The lords who had once bickered over scraps now gathered their retainers under his banner. War bands that had fought in isolation came together, carrying shields painted with different emblems yet marching toward the same cause. It was not unity as Rome had once known, but it was enough. For the first time in decades, British armies moved with purpose, not to flee, not to bargain, but to fight. Along the eastern shores, Saxon chiefs reveled in conquest, their halls loud with pride over stolen herds and seized fields. Convinced the West was starving and divided, they pushed further inland, each hall both fortress and statement of power. But pride dulled vigilance. At the edges of that expansion, Ambrosius struck, seizing advantage where glory mattered least, forcing the invaders to fight for land they had claimed too soon. The fighting was fierce and bitter. Along river valleys, Saxon war bands clashed with Britons, armed with long spears and oval shields handed down from older times. On ridges, where Roman roads still cut through the hills, cavalry thundered into battle, Ambrosius mounted nobles smashing into Saxon lines unused to such charges. The island had not seen campaigns of this scale since the days of the Empire, and though the tools of war had changed, the stakes had not. Whoever prevailed would shape the island's destiny. In victory, Ambrosius showed a discipline that set him apart from mere warlords. Spoils were shared fairly among his allies, not hoarded for himself. Captured villages were restored to local leaders rather than seized outright. Such actions bound men to him more tightly than chains. His followers knew they fought not for another tyrant, but for a leader who sought to restore a measure of justice in a world where justice had grown scarce. Saxons, though bloodied, did not collapse. Their numbers swelled with each summer's landings, fresh ships bringing warriors eager to claim soil of their own. Yet these newcomers no longer found a broken land waiting. They met resistance, organized and determined. Where once a handful of war bands could march unchallenged, now entire armies barred their path. Defeats that once seemed impossible became real, forcing Saxon chiefs to retreat to the safety of their coastal strongholds. One campaign after another built Ambrosius' legend. Tales spread of battles won through clever stratagems, ambushes sprung in narrow passes, night raids that scattered complacent invaders, cavalry charges that broke shield walls at the critical moment. Poets sang of his leadership, priests praised his devotion, and common folk carried stories of his victories into markets and halls. Whether all the details were true or not, the effect was the same. His name became a symbol of resilience. The contrast between cultures sharpened as the wars dragged on. In Saxon halls, victories were celebrated with boasts, feasts, and the passing of mead horns. In British strongholds, victories were marked with prayers of thanksgiving and the carving of new crosses into stone. Where Saxons buried their dead with weapons and ornaments, Britons laid their fallen to rest with Christian rites. Each side clung fiercely to its identity, and each clash reinforced the gulf between them. Regional differences also emerged. In Wales and Cornwall, where Roman influence had lingered longer, Ambrosius found allies more willing to fight for a vision of unity. In the north, leaders guarded their independence jealously, offering support only when Saxon pressure grew too great. In the east, where Saxons were already deeply entrenched, victories were harder to win and defeats more costly. The wars were not one continuous struggle, but a mosaic of campaigns, each shaped by the land and its people. Economy followed the fortunes of war. As Saxon pressure eased in certain regions, trade revived cautiously. Small coins, crude but serviceable, appeared again in circulation. Marketplaces reopened where roads were secure enough for merchants to travel. Blacksmiths forged not only weapons, but tools, evidence that the possibility of recovery existed if Ambrosius' momentum could be maintained. Hope became not only an emotion, but an economic force, driving men to rebuild rather than abandon. Yet war always demanded sacrifice. Fields lay fallow where armies had marched, villages emptied as families fled from battle zones, and famine returned when harvests failed. Ambrosius could rally warriors, but he could not always shield the innocent. Stories of suffering mingled with stories of triumph, and though victories lifted spirits, the cost of each campaign weighed heavily. Mothers grieved for sons, widows for husbands, and children for fathers. No leader, however noble, could change that truth. Still, Ambrosius' presence altered the balance of power. Saxon chiefs began to speak of him with respect, even as an enemy. They no longer saw the Britons as prey, but as opponents who could deal real blows. This shift mattered. It slowed Saxon expansion, forced them to consolidate rather than spread unchecked, and gave the Britons breathing space. For a generation raised in chaos, that breathing space felt like a miracle. The wars also seeded legend. Later traditions blurred Ambrosius with other figures, sometimes even with Arthur himself. Whether he rode at the head of every battle or merely inspired them mattered less than the impression he left. In memory, he became the archetype of resistance, noble, Roman, steadfast. Even centuries later, when chroniclers wrote of him, they described not only a man, but an age of hope forged in war. As the decade closed, Britain was not restored, but it was not lost either. The Saxons held the east, their settlements firm, their halls proud. The Britons controlled the west and much of the centre, united more than they had been in years. Between them stretched contested ground, battlefields where the future of the island would be decided again and again. Ambrosius had not ended the struggle, but he had changed its nature, from despair to defiance, from collapse to endurance. In his hall, feasts still echoed with oaths and songs. Messengers carried word of new alliances, priests blessed new crosses, and warriors sharpened swords for campaigns yet to come. The wars of Ambrosius did not bring peace, but they brought the conviction that peace was possible. That conviction would pass to the next generation, and in their time, another leader would rise, a warlord remembered not only in history, but in legend, whose name would live far beyond the wars themselves. The wars of Ambrosius had steadied a faltering land, but his time was passing. Age, wounds, and the wear of endless campaigns dimmed the strength that had once rallied Britain. As he faded from command, another figure began to gather attention. He was not born an emperor's son, nor draped in the authority of Rome. He rose instead through deeds. His name was Arthur, and in him the fractured peoples of the island glimpsed not just survival, but victory. The first stories of this war leader describe a man forged by conflict. Raised in an age when no boy reached manhood without blood on his hands, he learned to fight before he learned to rule. While Ambrosius had carried the dignity of Rome in his veins, Arthur embodied something different, the hard edge of the island itself, a commander who united tribes not through ancestry, but through the promise of triumph. In him, Britons saw the possibility of a new beginning. When he assumed command, the Saxons believed their time of waiting was over. They had endured setbacks under Ambrosius, yet the old Roman had been mortal, and mortality could be outlasted. With his passing, they expected the land to fragment again. Instead, Arthur emerged as a rallying point, turning disappointment into defiance. War bands that might have returned to bickering found themselves drawn to his banner, persuaded by victories won at his side and by the conviction that he could deliver what others only promised. The commander's strength lay not in noble birth, but in his ability to inspire. He demanded loyalty, but he also rewarded it. In his hall, warriors were honored not for their lineage, but for their courage. Around his table, oaths were spoken that bound men together as brothers, and the mead that passed between them carried the weight of shared destiny. No man fought alone when fighting for him. Each battle was a covenant of faith as much as of arms. His campaigns began in the borderlands where Saxon expansion pressed hardest. Scouts reported enemy movements along the Thames and into the valleys beyond. Instead of merely reacting, Arthur took the offensive. He struck at strongholds before they could consolidate, using speed and surprise to undo months of enemy preparation. Raids that once devastated villages now met swift retribution, and Saxon chiefs discovered that what they gained by day could be lost by night. Cavalry became his chosen weapon. Where his predecessor had relied on infantry and alliances, Arthur favored mounted warriors who could strike fast, break lines, and vanish before counterattack. Horses carried his name across the land, their hooves echoing through valleys as symbols of renewed strength. On open ground, his riders tore through shield walls. In narrow passes, they dismounted and fought with the same ferocity as foot soldiers. This flexibility baffled opponents who expected the old rhythms of war. Under his command, tactics evolved. The Saxons were no longer mere raiders. Their settlements had deep roots, their halls filled with families, their chiefs hardened by decades of struggle. To face them required not only courage, but vision. Arthur gave his people both. Each campaign he led was more than a battle. It was a demonstration that the invaders were not invincible, that Britain could still decide its own fate. Villages that had abandoned hope began to fortify again. Fields were ploughed with renewed confidence, and churches rang their bells not in mourning, but in thanksgiving. Stories of his leadership travelled far beyond the battlefield. Bards sang of his victories, priests preached of divine favour, and children repeated his name in play. Whether every tale was accurate mattered little. What mattered was the faith he inspired. In halls where despair had once sat heavy, laughter returned. Even in places he had not yet reached, the thought that he fought somewhere on the island gave people the strength to endure. The age was one of mingling traditions. and Arthur stood at the crossroads of them all. He inherited the memory of Rome, but carried it in a Celtic frame. His warriors bore long swords like their Saxon foes, but they fought under crosses and banners marked with Christian symbols. He welcomed allies from the west, where ancient clans still held sway, and from the north, where kings weighed survival against independence. His circle was not purely Roman, not purely native, but something new, born of necessity and vision. Trade along the Irish Sea added further strength to his cause. Ships brought not only goods, but news, and alliances stretched beyond Britain's shores. From Ireland came warriors willing to fight beside him. From Brittany came cousins of those who had fled in earlier generations, now returning to share in the struggle. These connections widened his reach, reminding the Saxons that Britain was not isolated. Each alliance added weight to his hand and made his banner more formidable. Relics of faith accompanied him into battle. Priests marched with his armies, blessing warriors before combat and offering absolution to the fallen. Crosses were planted on hills where victories were won, claiming the ground for both people and God. For his followers, these acts wove together survival and salvation, making each battle a holy contest. Whether Arthur himself saw it so is unknown, but his men believed, and belief turned their courage into steel. Legends would later exaggerate, painting him as a flawless hero, invincible in combat, chosen by heaven. The truth was harsher. He bled like any man, and losses were frequent. Not every campaign ended in triumph, and not every ally remained loyal. Yet his ability to recover from setbacks distinguished him. Where others faltered after defeat, he regrouped, rallied, and struck again. To those who followed, this resilience mattered more than perfection. In the years around 500 AD, his presence steadied the land. Britons no longer fought merely to endure, they fought to reclaim. Saxons, once bold in expansion, grew wary. Some retreated to coastal territories, others fortified their settlements more heavily. The frontier shifted, no longer a one-sided advance, but a contested zone where victories alternated, and neither side could claim final dominance. For the first time since the eagles of Rome had departed, the island's destiny felt uncertain, not because it was collapsing, but because it might yet be saved. Arthur's rise did not erase memory of Ambrosius. The elder leader's name still carried respect, and many of his allies now served under the younger man. But history had turned a page. The torch passed not by ceremony, but by necessity, and in the glow of that torch, new stories began to take shape. The age of survival was giving way to an age of resurgence. By decade's end, Britain's future no longer seemed a slow decline into conquest. It was a battlefield where outcomes were undecided, where victories piled into legend, and where one commander's name grew heavy with both hope and expectation. Arthur had not yet fought his greatest battles, but the stage was set. The land was ready for a contest that would decide more than borders. It would decide memory itself. And when those battles came, his name would be carried into them, not as a mere man's, but as the emblem of a people's defiance. The first years of Arthur's command had proved he could rally men and strike swiftly. Now came the greater test, whether victories could endure, whether the island could truly be defended against waves of invaders. Tales speak of a dozen battles fought under his banner, each one leaving its mark not only on the soil, but on the memory of a people desperate for triumph. The struggle stretched across valleys, forests, and river crossings. Along the Thames, shield walls clashed in thunderous collision, Saxon war cries meeting British horns. Near the Severn, riders swept down from the hills to scatter raiders who had thought the land undefended. In the north, battles raged where Roman roads still held firm, and the ghosts of empire seemed to watch as warbands fought for ground once patrolled by legionaries. Each victory bought time, and each defeat threatened to undo years of hard-won resolve. Arthur did not rely on strength alone. He studied the habits of his enemies, striking where their shield walls thinned, luring them onto ground where cavalry could break their formation. Scouts carried news swiftly to his hall, allowing him to move with a speed the Saxons could rarely match. His forces became known not only for their courage, but for their uncanny timing, appearing where they were least expected and vanishing before retaliation could gather. Warriors who fought beside him told of discipline as well as fury. When spoils were taken, they were divided fairly. When prisoners were captured, their fate was decided in council, not at the whim of a single sword. Such order distinguished his host from those of rival lords. Men flocked to serve him not merely for the chance of plunder, but for the assurance that their service would be honored. It was this fairness, as much as his skill, that bound so many tribes under one banner. Legends later embroidered the list of his victories. Nennius, writing centuries after, named them as the 12 battles. Some may have been exaggerated, others confused with different struggles. Yet the memory of continual triumph carried weight. To those who lived through the age, what mattered was not the number, but the pattern. Again and again, the Britons won when he led them. For a people long accustomed to retreat, this consistency felt like deliverance. The climax of these campaigns came at a place remembered as Mount Badon. Chroniclers placed it near the western hills, perhaps at Liddington, though certainty was lost in the mists of time. What remained was the tale of a great siege, when Saxon hosts gathered to crush the Britons once and for all. For days the two sides faced one another across ramparts and ditches, each waiting for the other to falter. Then came the charge that turned the tide. Cavalry streaming down the slopes, lances levelled, crashing into Saxon lines with a force that broke them utterly. Mount Badon became more than a victory. It was a turning point. Chroniclers claimed that after the battle, the island knew peace for decades. Whether absolute peace or simply a respite, the effect was profound. Saxon expansion halted. Villages once abandoned were rebuilt. Fields once left fallow were ploughed again, and churches rang their bells without fear of sudden raids. The people spoke not of survival, but of renewal. In the wake of Badon, prosperity blossomed in strongholds across the West and Midlands. Timber halls grew larger, their feasts richer. Stone crosses rose where warriors had fallen, inscribed with Latin prayers that link the living to both faith and heritage. Schools within monasteries taught children to read scripture, keeping alive the fragile flame of literacy. For a generation raised in chaos, such stability felt like a miracle, and many credited the commander who had delivered it. Saxons did not vanish. Their settlements remained along the eastern coasts, their halls still filled with warriors, their chiefs still plotting. But for a time, they dared not advance. Instead, they dug deeper roots, consolidating what they already held. The frontier between the two peoples hardened into a border that neither could easily cross. This containment allowed the Britons to breathe, to grow, to believe in themselves again. And all the while, songs of victory spread from one hall to another, keeping hope alive. His fame crossed the sea. In Brittany, kinsmen heard of the victories and took pride in shared blood. In Ireland, storytellers spoke of the war leader who had halted the tide of Saxons. Even in Gaul, merchants repeated his name, marveling that Britain, long thought lost, still stood defiant. The island, so often seen as a fading outpost, had become once again a place of interest, its destiny uncertain but alive. The victories carried more than political consequence. They reshaped memory. Children who had grown up fearing fire on the horizon now grew up hearing tales of battles won. Their lullabies spoke of warriors riding to glory, of a leader chosen by heaven to defend the land. Hope, once fragile, became the inheritance of a new generation. Where despair had reigned, pride now took root. Still, peace, however real, was never permanent. The Saxons nursed their losses, rebuilt their strength, and watched for weakness. Internal rivalries among the Britons simmered beneath the surface, threatening to undo unity once the urgency of war faded. But for the moment, these dangers seemed distant. The island basked in a rare calm, and the people savored the fruits of victory. The man at the center of it all became more than flesh and blood. Around hearths, stories embroidered his deeds. Priests spoke of divine favor guiding his hand, while bards praised his valor in verse. Fact and legend intertwined until they could no longer be separated. He was remembered not only as a commander of men, but as the guardian of a nation. His name, repeated in prayer and in song, became the banner beneath which memory itself would march. Thus ended the first great phase of his wars. From scattered victories to the triumph at Baden, the Britons had moved from desperation to strength. The Saxons remained, but they were checked, and for a generation, the island lived under a fragile but precious peace. The land would still know turmoil, but never again would the people believe themselves doomed beyond hope. They had seen what a leader could achieve, and they carried that knowledge forward. The battles of Arthur, whether counted as 12 or more, were remembered not for their number, but for their consequence. They proved that the island could resist, that unity could triumph over division, and that faith could endure alongside steel. When later ages looked back, they found in this time the seed of all the legends to come. The warrior who had led them into victory was no longer only a man. He was becoming the myth that would outlast kingdoms. The roar of battle faded, and in its place came something the island had not known for a lifetime: calm. After Mount Baden, the Saxon advance faltered. Raiding bands that once swept unopposed into valleys now lingered close to their coastal halls, wary of retaliation. The long peace that followed did not erase the scars of war, but it gave the Britons space to breathe, rebuild, and remember what life could be when not lived under constant threat. In villages across the West and Midlands, abandoned fields were sown again. Farmers returned to lands once trampled by armies, coaxing wheat from soil left fallow for years. Smoke rose from hearths in steadier rhythm, signaling not alarm, but daily life. Children grew up with stories of victory rather than of endless retreat, and for them, the war leader was less a desperate savior than a symbol of pride. Their earliest memories were of peace bought by courage, and that memory shaped the way they looked toward the future. The High King himself presided over this renewal. Where his predecessor Ambrosius had been a restorer, he became a keeper. His hall was no longer only a war camp, but a court, where disputes were settled, lords brought tribute, and alliances were secured. Feasts stretched long into the night, their tables heavy with meat and mead, while poets celebrated not just victories past, but the prosperity of the present. In those halls, the dream of unity did not fade with war's end. It grew into the foundation of rule. Churches flourished under his protection. Monasteries rose on rocky headlands and in quiet valleys, their stone walls standing where timber had sufficed before. Monks copied scripture, sang the hours, and taught children to read prayers in Latin. Priests blessed new wells, crosses crowned hilltops, and the faith wove itself into every layer of daily life. Though the Saxons still clung to their gods in the east, within British lands, Christianity shone brighter than it had since Rome's departure. To many, this rebirth of faith was as great a triumph as any won on the battlefield. Evidence of prosperity appeared in burials of the age. Chiefs and nobles were laid to rest with ornaments of silver and finely worked weapons, signs that wealth had returned. Imported goods, carried overseas by merchants who once feared the island, reached western shores again. Wine from Gaul, oils from the Mediterranean, glassware for noble tables. Such luxuries testified that Britain was no longer an afterthought. Peace had made it part of wider trade once more. Strongholds reflected this revival. Timber halls expanded, their beams thicker, their roofs higher, their decoration more elaborate. Walls and ditches were maintained, but not in constant desperation. Instead, they stood as reminders of strength, symbols that the land was guarded even in tranquility. In some places, poets and craftsmen gathered in lords' halls, producing songs, ornaments, and art that blended Roman inheritance with Celtic imagination. The years of calm were not merely a pause, they were a flowering. Even in peace, disputes simmered. Lords quarreled over pasture, borders, and tribute. Normally, such rivalries would have erupted into feuds, but the commander's presence kept them contained. His authority was respected across Britain's western and central realms, and his ability to mediate made him more than a war leader. He became an arbiter, a figure who ensured that the gains of Baden were not squandered by internal division. This balance gave the peace its unusual length. On the eastern frontiers, however, Saxon strength endured. Their halls in Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia did not vanish, nor did their ambitions. They bided their time, recovering from defeat, fortifying their lands, and preparing for the day when opportunity would return. Along borderlands, fortifications marked the divide. Earthworks raised by Britons to hold the line, timber walls built by Saxons to guard their settlements. For years, the frontier remained tense but largely quiet, a knife's edge where both sides knew the cost of renewed war. Cultural life deepened in this lull. Poets composed verses not only of war, but of love, faith, and the passing of seasons. Craftsmen shaped intricate metalwork, their designs blending spirals of Celtic tradition with Christian symbols. Songs once sung of hunger and exile now praised abundance and stability. In such creations lay the roots of later legend, for they cast the High King not merely as a soldier, but as the center of a golden age. Travel also increased. Messengers and merchants moved more freely along Roman roads that had been cleared and repaired, carrying news from Cornwall to Cumbria. Diplomats crossed the Channel to Brittany, strengthening ties with kin who had settled there in earlier generations. Stories spread of contacts with Gaul, where rulers regarded the island with renewed curiosity, surprised that it had not fallen completely to Saxon arms. These connections reminded Britons that they were part of a larger world, not an isolated remnant. For common folk, the peace meant security more than grandeur. Markets bustled with trade, fields yielded enough to feed families, and children reached adulthood without watching their villages burn. Families who had once hidden in hill forts now lived again in open farmsteads. The sound of hammer on anvil rang through villages as blacksmiths forged plows as well as swords. Though danger always lurked, life regained a rhythm that had been shattered for a generation. The commander himself grew into a figure larger than life. In the mouths of bards, he became not only a ruler, but a paragon of justice, courage, and generosity. Priests portrayed him as God's chosen defender, the man through whom divine providence had granted peace. Children knew his name before they knew their letters, and his presence became part of the landscape of memory. Already, legend was entwining itself with fact, weaving the man into something greater than human. Still, time does not pause, even for heroes. The years of calm brought not only prosperity, but age. Younger lords, who had never known the terror of constant raids, began to see peace as natural rather than extraordinary. Some grew restless, eager for greater independence. Others whispered that the Saxon menace was fading, that the need for unity was passing. The very success of the High King carried within it the seeds of future division. By the end of the 520s, signs of strain appeared. Border raids resumed, minor at first, but troubling in their persistence. Saxon chiefs tested defenses, probing for weakness. Within Britain, rival lords began to maneuver for position, calculating what would follow when the great commander's strength finally waned. The peace had been long, but it was not eternal. Beneath its surface, the forces of change gathered, waiting for their moment. Even so, none could deny what had been achieved. For over a decade, the island had known stability unmatched since Rome's departure. Fields were tilled, halls flourished, faith deepened, and children grew up without fear of the torch. That memory would linger long after the peace itself ended. Later generations, looking back from darker times, would remember these years as a golden age, the high point of British strength before the shadows returned. As the commander's influence began to wane, the question of succession loomed. Who could hold the fragile unity together? Who could prevent the rivalries of ambitious lords from shattering what had been built? The answer was uncertain. What was certain was that the calm of the Arthurian years could not last forever. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising that the island's fate would again be decided in blood. The golden calm that followed Baden did not last forever. Peace had given the Britons time to rebuild, but it also bred complacency. Younger lords, raised in years without fear of burning villages, no longer felt the urgency that had once bound their fathers together. Rivalries that had been buried for survival's sake rose again. The very unity that had held back the Saxons began to fray, not from outside pressure, but from within. The High King was aging. Years of battle, wounds carried from campaigns, and the weight of rule took their toll. He still presided over councils, still commanded loyalty when he spoke, but his presence no longer carried the unchallenged strength of earlier days. Ambitious men saw opportunity in his decline. Some whispered of succession, others plotted to expand their own domains. Without a clear heir to gather the island's fragments, the balance he had kept so carefully started to tip. Signs of strain appeared first along the frontiers. Saxon chiefs, long quiet, tested the defenses again. Small raids struck border villages, probing the response. Where once Britons had answered quickly and in unity, now hesitation marked their replies. Some lords chose to defend only their own valleys, refusing to send warriors beyond their borders. Others demanded tribute for aid. The spirit of solidarity forged in war had given way to bargaining, and the cracks widened with each passing season. Disputes among the Britons grew sharper. Arguments over pasture and territory that once would have been settled in the High King's court now flared into feuds. Strongholds that had once stood as symbols of resistance were turned against neighbors, their timber walls bristling with hostility rather than fellowship. In some places, blood was shed not against Saxons, but against fellow Britons. proof that the fragile unity of the island was breaking apart. The commander's authority held some of this unrest in check, but it was a waning influence. His voice could still calm tempers, but distance and age limited his reach. In regions far from his hall, local lords acted as they pleased, more concerned with their own power than with the fate of the whole. The island, once bound by fear of invasion, drifted back toward the fragmentation of earlier decades. Amid this tension came the story of Camlan. Later traditions told of a great battle where Arthur himself fell, struck down in conflict not with Saxons but with his own kin. Whether the tale preserves history or legend, it reflects the truth of the time. Internal strife had returned. Civil war, whispered in rumor and sung in sorrow, consumed the unity that had been bought with so much blood. The greatest danger was no longer the invader, but betrayal from within. The deaths of key leaders deepened the crisis. Men who had fought alongside Ambrosius and Arthur, who had carried the memory of Rome and the pride of victory, passed away one by one. With them went the weight of authority that had held younger lords in check. A new generation rose, less cautious, more eager for power. Their quarrels fractured alliances, and the dream of a united Britain slipped further from reach. Economic strains added to the decline. Trade, once revived under the shield of peace, faltered as insecurity returned. Roads became dangerous again, markets emptied, and coinage disappeared from circulation. Farmers hesitated to sow fields near contested borders, fearing that raiders would claim the harvest. Hunger returned, not in the crushing famines of earlier years, but as a steady erosion of prosperity. What peace had restored, disunity now squandered. Traces from the period tell of strongholds abandoned, ditches left unmaintained, and once busy settlements dwindling. These signs match the stories of chroniclers who wrote of disintegration. Where order had blossomed, neglect crept back in. The High King's generation had built, but their successors allowed decay. This was not a collapse all at once, but a slow unraveling, thread by thread. Saxon chiefs watched with keen interest. Their scouts reported weakening defenses. Their spies carried news of quarrels among the Britons. They bided their time, rebuilding strength, waiting for the moment when the island's disunity would give them their opening. Intelligence, not brute force, guided their strategy. The enemy learned that patience could succeed where reckless attack had failed. In the West, Christianity remained strong, but even the church could not heal the divisions. Bishops quarreled with local lords, monasteries defended their lands with armed retainers, and the unity of faith was overshadowed by the disunity of politics. Crosses still crowned hills, but beneath them, men fought one another as often as they prayed together. The moral authority that had once reinforced unity was diminished by worldly ambition. The memory of Rome, once embodied in Ambrosius and kept alive by Arthur's banner, now seemed distant. For many, it was no longer a living inheritance, but a fading story told by priests and poets. Younger warriors sought honor in local quarrels, rather than in defense of the island as a whole. The sense of belonging to something greater dwindled, replaced by the narrow horizons of clan and valley. Even in decline, legend grew. Tales of Arthur's battles spread far beyond Britain, reaching Brittany, Ireland, and Gaul. Stories told of a king who had united the island, who had driven back the Saxons, who had ruled in justice and glory. These stories often overlooked the divisions of his final years, turning memory into myth. In truth, his generation was unraveling. In memory, it was shining. The contrast between the two would shape how later ages remembered him. By the early 540s, the island was once again vulnerable. Unity had collapsed into factions. The High King was gone or diminished, and no single figure stood to replace him. Civil strife weakened defenses, trade faltered, and confidence eroded. The Saxons, waiting patiently, prepared to strike again. The age of hope was over, and the island stood on the edge of a new storm. Here ended the generation that had once seemed unshakable. Their victories had delivered peace, but their successes could not hold it. Division replaced unity, weakness replaced strength, and the balance of power tilted once more toward the east. Yet even in failure, their memory endured. Legends of Arthur's reign grew brighter as reality grew darker, a light carried in song and story even as the island slipped again into peril. The death of unity opened the way. Where once a single banner had held the island together, now only scattered lords defended their own valleys. Into this weakness the Saxons moved again, patient no longer. They had watched for decades while the Britons quarreled, and now the time was ripe to strike. Their spears gleamed not as raiders' weapons, but as the tools of conquest. Sails darkened the eastern horizon as new warbands crossed from the continent. Kent, long a Saxon foothold, became a base for fresh arrivals. Sussex and Essex grew stronger, their chiefs establishing firmer control over the fertile lowlands. Beyond these early realms, new leaders pushed inland, their eyes on the rich valleys that had once fed Roman towns. Each advance cut deeper into British territory, leaving villages burned and survivors driven westward. At the darkest possible hour, plague took hold. From the Eastern Empire, through Gaul and across the sea, came the sickness later called the Plague of Justinian. Between 541 and 549 AD, it swept the island. No fortress wall could keep it out, no sword could slay it. Families withered in their halls, fields lay untilled, and entire villages vanished. For the Britons, already weakened by division, the plague was a blow more devastating than any battle. Armies thinned, councils emptied, and faith itself seemed tested by a death that spared neither priest nor warrior. The Saxons suffered too, but the disease struck hardest at those already reeling. In western hills, where famine had never fully receded, the plague left valleys silent. Graves multiplied until the living could scarcely bury the dead. Survivors spoke of years when smoke rose not from hearths, but from funeral pyres. With their strength diminished, the Britons could not hold their borders. Saxon chiefs seized the opportunity, advancing while their enemies lay in mourning. By the late 540s, the shape of the island had shifted again. New kingdoms emerged in the east and south, carved from conquered soil. Kent, ruled firmly by its dynasties, became a gateway between Britain and the continent. Sussex expanded along the southern coast, its warriors boasting of victories that drove Britons inland. Essex secured the Thames Valley, controlling routes that once connected London to the wider world. These realms, still young, carried the seeds of permanence. Westward retreat became the story of the Britons. Families fled across the Severn into Wales, where mountain strongholds offered some protection. Others journeyed into Cornwall, clinging to the peninsula as their last inheritance. Some even sailed to Brittany, joining kin who had crossed generations earlier. The map of the island grew divided, Saxon realms spreading over fertile plains, and British enclaves confined to rugged corners, where survival depended on stubborn resistance. Sutton Hoo, though from a later generation, reflects the culture that now took shape among the Saxon elite. Great burials celebrated chiefs who saw themselves not merely as warriors, but as kings. Their treasures displayed connections to distant lands. helmets with Scandinavian craft, silver from the Frankish courts, ornaments hinting at wealth and diplomacy as much as plunder. These displays revealed ambition, not only to rule villages, but to stand as monarchs commanding realms. The Britons answered with memory. Songs of past victories, especially of Baden, were sung more fervently as defeats multiplied. Priests reminded congregations that their fathers had once driven back the tide, that faith and unity had once triumphed. Yet even as they spoke, reality pressed hard. Churches stood in shrinking territories, markets emptied, and halls grew quieter. The golden peace of earlier decades now seemed like a story drifting into legend. One clash stands out in these years: the Battle of Diorum in 577 AD. Though slightly beyond this span, rooted in the momentum of these renewed assaults. There, Saxon spears broke through the defences of the Severn Valley, cutting Wales from Cornwall and ensuring that the Britons would never again stand as a united Western Front. The road to that catastrophe was paved in the 540s and 550s, when division and plague left defences brittle. Saxon strategy grew sharper with time. No longer content with raids, their leaders planned campaigns with clear goals: capture of valleys, control of river crossings, seizure of towns. Their intelligence networks reported weaknesses, and their warriors moved swiftly to exploit them. Some Britons, weary of resistance, submitted rather than fled, serving new masters in exchange for survival. Gradually, the patchwork of Saxon settlements hardened into recognizable kingdoms. Amid this expansion, the memory of Arthur lingered like a ghost. Bards sang of his victories, peasants prayed for his return, and rumors whispered that he had not died at all but would come again when the island most needed him. These tales carried hope even as walls fell and borders shrank. Legend became a shield against despair, even if no army followed behind it. For the Saxons, confidence soared. Their children grew up knowing no fear of Roman legions or British high kings. To them, the island was theirs by right of conquest, and their halls stood as proof. They tilled fields once worked by villa farmers, worshipped gods beneath trees where Christian crosses had stood, and renamed rivers and hills in their own tongue. With each passing year, their identity as rulers of Britain deepened. Still, not all was loss for the Britons. In Wales, Cornwall, and the north, strongholds endured. Leaders like Urien of Reged and others yet to rise would continue the fight in later decades. Monks in hidden monasteries preserved learning, copied scriptures, and carried memory forward. Families told stories of Rome, of Ambrosius, of Arthur, ensuring that the past lived on even when the present seemed bleak. Defeat was real, but so was endurance. By the middle of the 6th century, the balance had shifted decisively. Saxon kingdoms stood firm across the east and south, their power growing, their culture thriving. The Britons remained only in fragments, their unity broken, their lands reduced, yet their spirit unextinguished. The plague had weakened them, the sword had driven them back, but memory and faith kept them from vanishing. Out of their loss, legend grew stronger, preparing to shape the centuries to come. The age of renewed Saxon expansion marked not just conquest, but transformation. Britain was no longer a Roman province, nor merely a battlefield. It was becoming a land of kingdoms, Saxon and British alike, each carving its place in the story. The struggle was far from over. Ahead lay new rulers, new wars, and the final resistance of those determined to preserve what little remained. Midway through the 6th century, the Saxon surge reached far inland. Coastal footholds had hardened into states with leaders and ambitions, no longer mere outposts. Britain had shifted from a struggle of invaders against resistors into a contest of kingdoms, British and Saxon, each seeking mastery. Kent rose first among these new powers. Its chiefs commanded the gateway to the continent, where merchants and envoys crossed from Frankish ports. Silver and wine flowed through Kentish harbours, enriching halls that once echoed only with war cries. Its rulers styled themselves not merely as war leaders, but as kings, heirs of Woden, claiming divine ancestry to buttress their right to rule. In Canterbury, their courts became centres where power was measured not only in spears, but also in wealth and alliances. Further west, Sussex gathered strength. From the Downs to the sea, Saxon warriors built halls on former villa lands, their cattle grazing where mosaics once glistened. Theirs was a smaller realm, but fiercely independent, its lords proud of victories that had driven Britons into the hills. In their songs, they boasted of standing as wolves among sheep, guardians of their own territory against all challengers. Essex, too, carved its place from the fertile Thames Valley. Control of river routes gave its rulers leverage, for goods moving inland or toward the sea passed through their lands. Their chiefs claimed the title of kings, though their influence waxed and waned depending on alliances with neighbours. Still, the territory held significance, for London lay within its grasp, a city diminished, but never entirely forgotten. Beyond these early realms, new forces stirred. In the south, warriors led by Cerdic's descendants laid the foundation of Wessex. Their advance cut deep into the valleys of Hampshire and Wiltshire, pressing against British holdouts in the west. Each victory planted another hall, each hall another claim. Their chiefs styled themselves not merely as conquerors, but as founders, envisioning a kingdom that would stretch far beyond its beginnings. To the north, Anglian settlers established footholds that would later grow into Mercia and Northumbria. At first, their settlements were scattered communities, clusters of farms along rivers and plains. But ambition was not lacking. Chiefs raised timber halls, where warriors feasted and plotted, their eyes on lands beyond their immediate borders. By the late 6th century, these scattered communities were already coalescing into realms that would dominate the island in centuries to come. As Saxon power expanded, the Britons retreated into strongholds in Wales, Cornwall, and the north. Yet even there, they did not vanish. Kings of Reged, Strathclyde, and Gwynedd still mustered armies, their poets praising victories against long odds. But the balance had shifted. Where once the Britons had contained the newcomers, now the newcomers contained them. Their survival depended on resilience rather than expansion. Administration among the Saxons grew more sophisticated. What had begun as warbands bound by oaths evolved into systems of tribute and law. Chiefs demanded food rents from farmers, established assemblies to judge disputes, and issued commands that bound entire districts. Customary payments replaced endless blood feuds, setting fines for injury and compensation for death. Vergild, man price, became the measure of justice, ensuring that vengeance did not always end in endless cycles of killing. Religion remained divided. Pagan gods still held sway in Saxon halls, where oaths were sworn by Woden and Thuna. Sacred groves hosted rituals, and sacrifices honored spirits of land and sky. Yet Christian influence lingered. In Kent especially, contact with the Franks brought whispers of conversion. Queens and princesses carried crosses from Frankish courts into Saxon halls, planting seeds that would later transform entire realms. For now, faith remained contested ground, one more border in a land full of them. Historical traces from this time show halls at Yeovering and other royal sites, places where timber buildings spread in orderly patterns. These were not mere villages, but centers of rule, where kings displayed wealth, administered law, and summoned warriors. Here, feasts bound men to their lords, poetry exalted ancestry, and judgments were pronounced before assembled freemen. Such places reveal the Saxons' transformation from settlers into rulers, their authority no longer limited to the battlefield. Economy expanded alongside political power. Saxon farmers adopted practices from the Britons they displaced, ploughing fields with improved tools, tending herds, and producing surpluses that could support kingship. Trade networks grew, carrying goods across the Channel and into northern Europe. Amber from the Baltic, glass from Gaul, and silver from Frankish mints found their way into Saxon halls. The blending of local and foreign goods created cultures at once rooted in Britain and connected to the wider world. For the Britons, these changes deepened the sense of eclipse. Once the inheritors of Rome, they now looked upon Saxon kings who commanded wealth and armies. Yet memory remained powerful. Poets sang of Arthur and Ambrosius, of the golden years when the island had resisted. These songs kept alive the sense that Britain was not lost, even as lands shrank and influence waned. In faith and in memory, the Britons endured, shaping an identity that would survive long after their kingdoms fell. By the 500s and 70s, Saxon kingdoms stood firm. Kent ruled its gateway, Sussex its coast, Essex its valley, Wessex its downs, Anglian settlers their northern plains. None yet commanded the whole island, and rivalries among them prevented complete dominance. Still, the momentum was clear. The age of scattered warbands was over. The age of kingdoms had begun. Kingship itself took on a new dignity. Genealogies traced back not merely to chieftains, but to gods. Rulers claimed descent from Woden, presenting themselves as heirs of divine authority. Their bards recited lineages that stretched into myth, binding the present to an imagined past of heroes and deities. Such stories legitimized power, turning mortal kings into figures of destiny in the eyes of their followers. The Britons, though pressed, continued to resist where they could. In the north, Urien of Reged and his allies launched campaigns that checked Anglian expansion. In Wales, fortresses still bristled on hilltops, their defenders watching the plains below. Their victories were fewer, but their determination remained. They had lost much, but they had not surrendered. The years between 560 and 580 marked a turning of the tide. The Saxons had become more than conquerors. They had become rulers. Their kingdoms were fragile, but they were real. Administration, trade, and culture deepened their hold on the land. Meanwhile, the Britons, confined to smaller enclaves, clung to faith and memory. The balance of the island had changed forever, but history is never still. Rivalries among Saxon realms promised new conflicts. The Britons, though diminished, still dreamed of recovery. Poets reminded them that empires had fallen before and risen again. As one age ended, another began. The age of kingdoms clashing, alliances shifting, and final resistance stirring in the west and north. The Saxon kingdoms spread across the eastern lowlands, their halls echoing with pride. Yet resistance in the north and west had not vanished. In those rugged lands where mountains rose and rivers cut deep, British kings still held their thrones. They ruled less territory than their fathers, but their determination burned fiercely. If conquest had pushed them back, memory and honor kept them standing. One such figure was Urien of Reged. From his stronghold in the north, he gathered allies and kin, striking at Anglian settlers who had begun to push beyond their river valleys. His campaigns carried the weight of tradition. for he styled himself not only as a local king, but as the protector of British freedom. Poets praised his victories in song, their verses carrying his name into every hall from Cumbria to Strathclyde. In Urien, warriors saw not just a lord, but a champion who reminded them of heroes past. Battles erupted across the borderlands of Northumbria. Anglian hosts marched under banners of their rising kings, seeking to claim the valleys of the north. Britons met them with ambushes in forests, with charges down rocky slopes, with stubborn shield walls that refused to yield. Each clash drained both sides, yet the struggle was more than military. It was a contest of endurance, a question of whether the old peoples of the island could still stand against relentless newcomers. Poetry preserved the memory of these struggles. Why Gododin, composed in honor of fallen warriors from the north, tells of feasts held before battle and the doom that awaited. Talisin, bard to Urien, sang of victories and valor, shaping memory into legend. These works were more than entertainment. They were weapons of morale, reminding a people hemmed in by loss that courage remained their inheritance. In their verses, defeat could be transformed into glory, and death itself became a form of victory. The terrain favored the defenders. Hills and narrow passes made cavalry less effective, forcing Anglian hosts into costly assaults. Fortresses rose on crags and riverbanks, their timber palisades bristling against the sky. From these vantage points, Britons hurled back attackers, turning geography into ally. Even when strongholds fell, the effort weakened the conquerors, slowing their advance and proving that the west and north would not be taken easily. In Wales, resistance was no less fierce. Kings of Gwynedd and Powys fortified their lands, their halls alive with warriors ready to fight at a moment's notice. Cornwall, though pressed on every side, clung stubbornly to its independence. Families who traced their ancestry back to the age of Rome defended valleys where Latin prayers still mingled with native tongue. For them, survival itself was victory, proof that the Saxon tide could be resisted. Tactics shifted with necessity. Britons adopted swift raids, harrying enemy villages and burning storehouses before slipping back into their hills. They used speed and surprise to offset Saxon numbers, denying their foes the chance to fight on open ground, where shield walls dominated. These strikes could not reclaim lost plains, but they kept enemy lords wary, reminding them that conquest would never be easy. Religion played its part in this last resistance. Churches and monasteries became centers of identity, preserving memory and rallying fighters, with the conviction that they defended not only their homes, but their faith. Crosses marked battlefields as holy ground, priests blessed warriors before they marched, and victories were celebrated as signs of divine favor. Pagan Saxons offered sacrifices to their own gods, and in this clash of peoples, the conflict of faiths added deeper meaning to every fight. Despite determination, the balance of power tilted steadily eastward. Anglian settlements multiplied, their halls spreading across the valleys that had once belonged to British kings. Each defeat cut away more land, and each loss of territory made resistance harder. Even victories could not reverse the tide. Urien himself fell, betrayed and killed, and with him, the dream of a lasting northern coalition flickered out. His death was mourned in verse, but the unity he had sought dissolved with him. Still, the legacy of these years endured in song. Jagododin immortalized the warriors of the north, praising their bravery even as they perished. Taliesin's verses carried the memory of Urien, ensuring that his struggle was never forgotten. These works became treasures, reminders that the Britons had not simply vanished, that they had fought with honor to the end. Poetry became their shield against oblivion, guarding their identity even as kingdoms fell. Further south, Saxon victories pressed hard. Along the Severn Valley, the Battle of Diorum in 577 had already broken the link between Wales and Cornwall. By the late 6th century, the separation was complete. No longer could the Britons of the southwest easily join with their northern kin. Each region fought alone, and isolation weakened them further. Saxon kings seized the opportunity, carving more firmly the realms that would endure: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. Still, not all was loss. In remote valleys and mountain fastnesses, British rule survived. In Strathclyde, kings maintained their courts, blending old traditions with new necessities. In the west of Wales, monasteries flourished, teaching and preserving scripture. Cornwall, though small, remained unconquered, its people tied to the sea and to legends of Arthur and Ambrosius. These fragments kept alive the inheritance of Rome, long after its empire had vanished. Trade continued in small measure. Irish allies crossed the sea to support resistance, bringing warriors and goods. Connections to Brittany remained strong as families maintained ties across the Channel. These networks provided not only supplies, but morale, proof that the Britons were not alone. Across the seas, cousins remembered them, and that memory gave strength to those who endured. By the close of the 6th century, however, the verdict of history was clear. Saxon power dominated the plains and valleys, while the Britons clung to edges and highlands. The great kingdoms of the newcomers had taken root, their halls filled with wealth, their laws binding subjects, their rulers boasting of descent from gods. The age of British supremacy was over. What remained was defiance, fierce, proud, and unwilling to yield. The final resistance did not save the island, but it preserved something deeper. It ensured that the Britons were remembered, not as a people who vanished, but as a people who fought. Their poets captured their struggles, their priests recorded their names, and their children carried forward the legends. In that memory lay survival of another kind, one that no sword could erase. As the century closed, the struggle shifted toward its last phase. Saxon kingdoms consolidated their rule, while the Britons retreated into Wales, Cornwall, and the far north. The clash was not yet over, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Only a few battles remained before the eclipse of the Britons was complete. The dawn of the 7th century brought with it the final reckoning. For centuries, the Britons had fought, resisted, and endured, but the balance now stood firmly against them. Saxon realms had grown from scattered settlements into kingdoms with thrones, laws, and ambitions. Britain itself was no longer a contested province of Rome's shadow, but the homeland of new powers. Only fragments of the old inheritance remained, clinging to survival in the island's western corners and northern heights. This decisive moment came around 616 AD, when battle was joined near Chester. There, the kings of Northumbria sought to expand their reach into the borderlands, while Britons gathered to resist one more time. The clash was brutal. Saxon spears pressed forward in disciplined ranks, while British warriors charged with the courage of desperation. At first the defenders held, but weight of numbers and discipline broke their shield lines. When the struggle ended, the field was littered with the bodies of fallen nobles and shattered warbands. The defeat at Chester marked more than a battlefield loss. It severed the last threads of British unity in the north. Such consequences were immediate. By controlling Chester, the Saxons split the Britons of Wales from those of the north, ensuring they could no longer coordinate. Isolated valleys and distant kingdoms were left to stand alone, each too weak to threaten Saxon dominance. What had once been a loose but living network of resistance became a scattering of enclaves, surrounded and contained. The hope of reconquest vanished on that field. Northumbria emerged as the great power of the age. Its rulers, heirs of Anglian settlers, now commanded lands stretching from the Humber to the Forth. Strongholds rose at Bamberg and York, halls where kings styled themselves not as petty chiefs, but as monarchs of vast dominions. From their courts radiated authority, binding lords and farmers alike beneath a system of tribute, justice, and law. The Britons who once called those valleys home were either subdued, driven out, or reduced to remnants in remote hills. To the south, Wessex expanded with equal determination. Descendants of Cerdic pressed deeper into the west, their armies cutting into valleys once ruled by British chieftains. Their campaigns drove wedges between the enclaves of Cornwall and central Wales, ensuring that no single coalition could challenge them. Each victory added not only land but prestige, and their kings began to dream of a destiny that stretched far beyond local conquest. Mercia, rising in the Midlands, pressed outward as well. Born from the settlements of Anglian migrants, it grew into a formidable kingdom by asserting control over river routes and fertile plains. Its rulers claimed authority over regions that had once been Roman heartlands, planting their banners on soil where legionaries had marched and councils had gathered. In Mercian expansion, the eclipse of the Britons became irreversible. For the defeated, survival took new forms. In Wales, Christian kings still ruled, their halls filled with poets who preserved memory in verse. In Cornwall, fishermen and farmers clung to the land's edges, drawing strength from the sea. In Strathclyde and Cumbria, northern kings held fast against mounting pressure. These realms were smaller and weaker than the Saxon powers, yet they carried within them the embers of identity. Their people still spoke in the old tongue, still sang of Arthur and Ambrosius, still prayed in churches that looked back to Rome. Though politically diminished, culturally they endured. The battlefield itself bore witness to change. Saxon shield walls dominated the plains, disciplined ranks advancing like iron waves. British cavalry, once the pride of Arthur's wars, found fewer open fields to decide their fate. Fortresses that had withstood raids for generations fell one by one, undermined not by assault alone, but by hunger, betrayal, and exhaustion. Where once the defenders had struck fear into invaders, now they fought as the last guardians of memory. Religion shaped the struggle's meaning. Britons prayed for deliverance, invoking saints and martyrs, while Saxons still clung to the old gods, their kings boasting of descent from Woden. Yet even this was beginning to shift. Missionaries crossed from Ireland and Gaul, planting crosses in Saxon lands and baptizing their leaders' children. Christianity, once the defining marker of British resistance, would soon flow into the very halls that had been their enemies' strongholds. The faith outlived the political order that had carried it, binding conqueror and conquered alike to a common destiny. Archaeological traces from these years tell a story of abandonment and transformation. Roman towns lay in ruins, their stones quarried for Saxon halls. British fortresses were deserted, their earthworks left to grass and silence. Yet Saxon settlements flourished, their cemeteries filled with goods that proclaimed confidence and permanence. What the Britons lost, the newcomers claimed, reshaping the landscape in their own image. Still, the Britons did not vanish into silence. Their poets ensured that names and deeds endured. Wigododin, Taliesin's verses, and countless oral tales kept alive the memory of resistance. Legends of Arthur grew brighter in defeat, magnifying victories of the past into eternal symbols. Stories told of a king who would return, who had never truly died, who slept in hidden places waiting for the day when Britain would need him again. In these legends, loss became hope, and defeat became prophecy. The Saxons, for their part, began to see themselves not as settlers, but as natives of the land. They renamed rivers and hills, reshaped laws to fit their customs, and married their lineage into soil that now belonged to them by conquest. Their kingdoms endured not as temporary footholds, but as enduring states, the foundation of the England to come. Their rulers minted authority in blood and memory, carving permanence from what had once been foreign ground. By 620 AD, the struggle was decided. The Britons remained only in Wales, Cornwall, and the far north. Their kingdoms were small, their influence limited, their survival precarious. Yet they preserved what they could: language, faith, story. The Saxons ruled the heart of the island, their kingdoms linked by bloodlines and rivalries, already contending with one another for supremacy. The long war was over. A new age had begun. The eclipse of the Britons did not erase them, but it ended their primacy. Their inheritance survived in fragmentary kingdoms, in the songs of poets, and in the legends that cast their leaders as timeless heroes. The Saxons had triumphed on the battlefield, but memory remained British. That memory would pass across generations, carried into Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and beyond, ensuring that even in defeat, the old peoples of the island were never forgotten.